I still remember that day clearly. The day I realized how deeply invisible I had become in the eyes of my own family. The air was thick with the sounds of laughter and chatter, the kind of noise that fills a room when everyone's gathered for a reunion. But beneath the surface, tension simmered, and I was about to become the target of a wound I hadn't seen coming. My father's voice cut through the noise, cold and sharp as a knife. "I'm proud of all my children, except the loser." Those words hung in the air, heavier than any silence. My heart sank, a sharp stab of shame and disbelief. The room seemed to freeze. People looked at me as if I were already dead to them. And in that moment I felt smaller than I ever had before. I left without a word. No one stopped me. No one asked if I was okay. I walked away not just from a family reunion but from the idea of family itself. The invisible thread that had connected me to those people snapped in an instant. For years after, I carried that moment inside me, a heavy stone pressing down on my chest. I told myself to be strong, to not let it define me, but every time I looked in the mirror, I saw the shadow of that rejection staring back. I became a ghost in my own life, present but unseen, silent but aching to scream. At school, I buried myself in books and writing, the only places where I felt some semblance of control. Words were my refuge. I wrote stories of pain and hope, anger and forgiveness, but never shared them with anyone. How could I? What use was a voice if no one wanted to hear it? I drifted through friendships like a shadow, never fully present, never fully known. The ache of loneliness wrapped around me like a cloak I couldn't shed. But somewhere beneath all that pain, a tiny spark flickered. A stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to turn my story around. To reclaim my voice. To become more than the label my father had cast on me. That journey was anything but easy. It was filled with nights of despair and days of doubt. I stumbled over my own fears, battled the ghosts of rejection, and faced the crushing weight of self-loathing. Yet it was through that struggle that I discovered something powerful. Stories have the ability to heal, to connect, to transform. Slowly I began to share pieces of my truth. First in whispers, then in words, and finally in declarations. I found others who had been silenced, who carried wounds similar to mine. Together we created a space where our voices could rise, imperfect, raw, and real. That space became a sanctuary, a place not just to be heard but to belong. I realized that my pain was not a curse but a thread woven into a larger tapestry of human experience. And by telling my story, I helped others tell theirs. This is the story of how I turned rejection into resilience. How I transformed invisibility into a chorus of voices. How I found healing not just for myself, but for countless others who thought they were alone. If you've ever felt like the loser, the outcast, the invisible one, this story is for you. Because your voice matters. Your story matters. And there is a sanctuary waiting for every echo. My name is Ethan, and this is the story of the day I stopped being a son. It happened on a Sunday. One of those days that try too hard to feel warm, pleasant, and full of love, but underneath you can sense something bitter simmering. It was our annual family reunion. Plastic chairs, grilled meat, kids running in circles, and adults smiling like their faces had forgotten how to do anything else. I was 27, sitting at the far end of the table next to the cooler, half listening to conversations about mortgages and travel plans. I had no mortgage, no travel plans, no real job, no applause-worthy achievements. Just me, barely holding it together, trying to believe I still had time. When my dad stood up with his beer in hand, I knew something was coming. He always made a speech at these things. Always turned it into a moment about family pride and legacy. He had this habit of performing parenthood instead of practicing it. But that day something inside him snapped. Or maybe it was always there and he finally stopped hiding it. "I just want to say how proud I am of my kids," he began, smiling like a politician at a press conference. People clapped, raised their drinks. I gave a small nod, more to myself than anyone else. He turned to Mark, my older brother. "Mark, you've done more by 30 than I had done by 50. Built your business from the ground up. Married a strong woman, 2 wonderful kids. You're a man I'd be proud to call my own even if you weren't my son." Mark smirked, humble as always, but you could tell he loved it. People cheered. Our aunts and uncles beamed. Then he turned to Lily, the baby of the family. "And Lily, God, what a gift you've been. Smart, disciplined. A future doctor. You make us proud every single day." More applause. Lily smiled, shy but glowing. My mom wiped a tear from her eye. Then there was silence. He looked at me. He held the pause like it was a performance. Then came the punch. And Ethan, he laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. Well, I'm proud of all my children except the loser. Some people laughed like it was a joke. Some gasped. Others went quiet. But I just sat there. So numb. It wasn't the first time he humiliated me, but it was the first time he did it in front of everyone without even pretending. I looked around. No one stopped him. No one stood up for me. Not Mark. Not Lily. Not even Mom. So I stood up. Fully. Not in anger. Just done. I didn't say a word. Didn't flip a table. Didn't ask for an apology. I just walked past the food, the fake smiles, the laughter that had now turned awkward. I walked out of that backyard, out of that house, out of their world. No one followed me. When I reached my car, I sat behind the wheel, keys in my hand, staring at the street. For the first time in my life, I realized I was truly alone. Not in the sense of being without people, but in the sense that the people who should have protected you, believed in you, had quietly decided you were not worth the fight. I started the car. The engine groaned like it knew how tired I was. I drove aimlessly for hours, through towns I didn't know, past homes that weren't mine, trying to outrun the echo of that word, loser. By the time I pulled into a cheap motel parking lot 3 towns over, the sun was already setting. I sat on the bed, lights off, still wearing my reunion clothes. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at the ceiling like it might offer me answers. It didn't. But something shifted in me that night. A flicker of something fierce. Maybe anger. Maybe clarity. Maybe survival. I opened my phone, scrolled through old messages, old job applications, old rejection emails. My life was a graveyard of second chances never given. But for the first time I stopped waiting for someone to pull me out. If I was going to rise, it would be alone. Without their pride. Without their blessing. Maybe even because of their shame. I didn't know how yet. I had no plan. No savings. No idea where to begin. But I knew one thing. I would never sit at that table again as the family's disappointment. Someday he'd say my name again. And it would burn him to do it. The next morning I woke up with the same clothes, the same air of shame hovering around me like smoke. My mouth was dry, my back sore from the cheap mattress, and I felt a strange mix of emptiness and determination. I didn't know where I was, literally. I had driven so far out of my usual radius that even my phone was confused. The motel curtains let in slivers of gray light. Outside, the world was moving. People were living. I was floating. I sat up, rubbed my face, and asked myself a simple question. Now what? There was no dramatic answer. Just silence. The kind of silence that's too honest to ignore. I checked my bank account. $183.47. That was it. No job, no home, no direction. My name was nowhere on anyone's success story. But I was done being numb. That much I knew. I found a local coffee shop, asked if they needed help. They didn't. I asked again the next morning. Still no. But on the third day the owner, a middle-aged woman named Carla with a smoker's laugh and tired eyes, shrugged and said, "You can clean the floors if you want. Pays cash. Under the table." I said yes. Not because I loved floors, but because I needed to feel useful. So that became my life. Wake up. Clean. Serve. Sweep. Repeat. I didn't tell anyone where I was. I deleted the family group chat. Mark texted once. Some generic, "Everything okay?" message I ignored. Lily didn't text at all. Mom sent a thumbs-up reaction to a meme 2 weeks later. That was the full extent of their worry. And yet something strange started to happen. Every day, surrounded by strangers, I felt freer. No expectations. No comparisons. I wasn't Ethan, the disappointment. I was Ethan, the guy who mopped the floor well. And for now that was enough. After work I'd go to the library, small, quiet, mostly empty. I started reading again. Books I never finished. Topics I used to love before life convinced me I wasn't smart enough. Psychology. Design. Writing. I wrote things in a notebook I bought at the dollar store. Thoughts. Observations. Dreams I didn't know I still had. A month passed. Then I moved into a tiny room above the diner across the street. The walls were thin and the water smelled like metal, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, every single thing I had earned. Not because someone gave it to me. Not because I inherited it. Because I stayed standing when everyone expected me to fall. One night, while cleaning tables, Carla looked at me and said, "You're not like the others who pass through here. You're rebuilding." That word hit me harder than any insult ever could. Rebuilding. Not broken. Not lost. Rebuilding. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote 4 words at the top of a clean page. I will not disappear. Because maybe that's what I feared the most. That they would forget me. That I would become the punchline and nothing else. But I wasn't gone. I was just getting started. It started with a flyer. Bright orange, taped to the window of the library. Community writing contest. Theme. Second chances. I stared at it for several minutes. Something about those words lit a fuse inside me. I tore the bottom tab with the website link and stuffed it in my pocket. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the pages I'd written in that dollar store notebook. The things I never said out loud. The things I couldn't say at the reunion in front of my father. What if I could write them? Not as a revenge piece but as truth. My truth. So I started. For weeks after my shift in library hours I wrote in my room. The chair was uncomfortable and the lamp flickered every so often, but I didn't care. The words poured out of me like they had been waiting years. I wrote about failure. About shame. About rebuilding. And slowly the story formed. A fictional character named Liam, but anyone who knew me would recognize him. When the deadline came, I submitted the story with no expectations. It was the act of writing that healed me more than the outcome. For the first time I felt heard, even if it was only on paper. 3 weeks later I got an email. I had one. I reread the email 3 times, sure it was a mistake. But it wasn't. My story had been chosen. There would be a reading event. A small one, nothing extravagant. But they asked if I wanted to read it aloud. I almost said no. The thought of standing in front of strangers, exposing that much of myself, terrified me. But something deeper urged me to say yes. And so, on a Thursday evening, I stood in a modest room above a bookstore, holding printed pages that shook in my hands. As I read, people listened. Really listened. And when I finished, the applause was soft but real. A woman in the back wiped a tear. A man near the front nodded slowly, like he understood every word. Afterward, someone approached me. A woman named Beth who ran a small publication for local writers. She asked if I had more stories. I didn't. But I said yes. That night, I walked back to my room, under a sky full of stars I hadn't noticed in months. I wasn't just rebuilding. I was becoming. Beth kept her word. She published my story in the next issue of her magazine. It was a small print run, maybe a few hundred copies, but it felt monumental. Seeing my name in ink, Ethan Cole, right there beneath the title, did something irreversible to my sense of self. I wasn't invisible anymore. A few days later, an email came through her contact form. A literary agent. Independent, low profile, but real. He'd read the story and asked if I was working on anything longer, maybe a novel. I laughed out loud when I read that. A novel? Me. But later that night, in the quiet of my room, I opened my notebook and flipped back through everything I'd written. Pages upon pages of Liam's journey. I realized I wasn't just telling a story, I was rewriting my own. I emailed the agent back. Yes. I'm working on something. Took 5 months. 5 months of writing every night after my shift, every morning before work, during breaks, on napkins, on receipts, in the margins of newspapers. When I finished, the manuscript was raw, imperfect, but alive. He loved it. We signed a contract. A small publisher picked it up. Modest advance. Modest expectations. But it didn't matter. I was becoming the kind of person I never believed I could be. And I was doing it alone. When the book came out, the diner crew threw me a celebration. Carla made cupcakes shaped like books. Beth brought copies for everyone to sign. For once, I didn't feel like I was pretending. Then one night, something unexpected happened. I got a message from Mark. "Hey, just saw your book online. Didn't know you were writing. Congrats. Looks impressive." I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't reply. Because part of me still remembered that backyard. The silence. The look in their eyes when they didn't stop him. But another part of me wanted to forgive. I wasn't ready yet. But maybe one day. Because even though I had no place in their pride back then, I was learning how to be proud of myself. And that, finally, was enough. The message from Mark lingered in my mind longer than I wanted to admit. I hadn't heard from him in nearly a year. That night at the reunion had cleaved a permanent crack between us, or so I believed. His message was short, careful, and too polite. But still it was something. And even though I told myself I didn't care, I found myself rereading it, wondering what he really meant, wondering what he'd say if I replied. I didn't respond, not yet. I was still building the version of me that could. In the meantime, the book started to pick up quiet momentum. It didn't explode overnight, but people read it, shared it, found a home in places I never expected: book clubs, community centers, even a few schools. And with every review, every message from a reader who saw a bit of themselves in Liam, I felt more connected to the world than I ever had at that family table. One day I got a letter. An actual letter, handwritten. It was from a woman named Irene. She said her son had dropped out of college and was living with her again. He read my book, and for the first time in months he opened up. Cried. He said he didn't feel so alone anymore, she wrote. Thank you for giving him that. I cried reading it. Ugly, grateful, silent tears. There was no paycheck, no award that could match that feeling. Somewhere in all of this, I started hosting a writing group at the library. Nothing fancy. Just a table of misfits. Teenagers, retirees, single moms, men who looked like they hadn't spoken about feelings in years. We shared stories. We listened. We laughed. Sometimes we just sat in silence and wrote. It became my favorite part of the week. One night after a session, Carla pulled me aside. You ever think of going back? She asked. Back where? I said, though I already knew. To them. The question made my stomach turn. I don't know, I said honestly. Sometimes I think about it, but then I remember how quiet they all were. How no one said a word. She nodded, pulling out a cigarette and lighting it with that same worn Zippo. Sometimes people freeze, you know. Doesn't mean they didn't care. I looked away, watching the smoke rise into the evening air. I don't need their apology, I said. Maybe not, she said, exhaling. But maybe you need your own closure. Not for them. For you. That night I dreamed of my childhood home. Of my dad in the driveway, oil on his hands, laughing like he used to. I woke up with a weight on my chest I couldn't explain. It was time. A week later I stood on their porch. I didn't call. I didn't warn them. I rang the doorbell, heart pounding like a war drum. The door opened and it was Mom. Her face, older than I remembered. Tired. And instantly wet with tears. Ethan, she whispered. Hi, Mom. She pulled me into a hug before I could say anything else. I didn't resist. Inside everything looked the same but smaller. Like grief had shrunk the house. We sat. She cried. I let her. Then came Mark. Then Lily. We didn't yell. We didn't argue. We talked. And for the first time they listened. Really listened. Finally my dad walked in. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at me like he wasn't sure I was real. I read your book, he said, his voice low. Oh. I read it twice. He sat down slowly, his eyes shining. You were never the loser, Ethan. I was just too scared to admit that you were the only one brave enough to be yourself. I swallowed the lump in my throat. He reached for my shoulder. I'm sorry, son. And just like that, the weight I carried for years began to lift. We weren't healed in that moment. But maybe we had finally started. Because sometimes the apology doesn't fix everything. But it opens the door to begin again. Forgiveness, I quickly learned, is not a moment. It's a process. That evening at my parents' house cracked open the door. But it didn't heal the years of silence, the hurt tucked into every memory. The dinner that followed was awkward. Conversations stuttered. Eyes dropped. We all danced around the ghosts in the room. My dad, true to himself, barely spoke after the apology. He looked like a man who had spent years believing a story about his son and was only now realizing it might have been a lie. I didn't push him. I wasn't there for revenge or redemption. I was there to say, I'm still here. When I left that night, Mom hugged me tight again, whispering, Don't disappear again, Ethan. I won't, I said. But I can't come back and pretend nothing happened. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I know. The drive back to my tiny rented room felt different. Not because something was resolved, but because I had chosen to face it. And I realized something else. Facing the people who broke you is sometimes less about closure and more about reclaiming your voice. Back in town, life picked up pace. My second book was in early development. This one was different. Less personal, more thematic. Still fiction, still rooted in truth, but broader. It was about outsiders. About invisible people doing the quiet work of surviving. People like me before the words gave me a life. I kept leading the writing group. It grew. Teenagers brought friends. The old veterans opened up more. Even Carla started scribbling things between orders. She said it helped her sleep. We became a strange little family. No judgments. No hierarchy. Just stories and the people brave enough to tell them. One afternoon I got a call. It was from a community college in a nearby town. A professor had read my book and invited me to speak to her creative writing students. I said yes before my fear could stop me. Public speaking had never been my thing, but something about this felt important. The day of the event, I stood in front of 30 students, most of them young, wide-eyed, expectant. I told them the truth, not just the polished version. I told them about failure, about being labeled, about being silenced, and about the decision to speak anyway. After the talk, a girl approached me, maybe 19, with shaking hands. I wanted to give up, she said. But your story made me think maybe I just haven't started yet. I'll never forget her face. Or her name, Jasmine. Weeks later, she emailed me a short story she wrote. It was raw, trembling, full of mistakes, and beautiful. I printed it out and kept it in my notebook. Because that's what this was all about. Not best-selling lists. Not applause. But echoes. Ripples. Meanwhile, my dad sent a message. Want to grab lunch? I stared at it for a long time. We met at a small diner halfway between our towns. It was quiet, neutral ground. He was already there when I arrived, looking out the window like someone searching for a version of himself he hadn't seen in decades. We talked. Fully. About neutral things first. Weather. Books. The economy. Then silence. He said, "You know, I didn't know how to be a dad to someone like you." I raised an eyebrow. Someone like me? He nodded. Someone who felt things. Who didn't just follow the rules and smile through it. That's not a bad thing, I said. I know that now, he said. Back then I was scared. That you'd fall apart. That you wouldn't survive the world. I thought if I toughened you it would save you. It didn't. I see that now, he said. And I'm sorry I made you carry all that pain alone. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. But when we left that diner I felt lighter. Because sometimes the greatest act of love is simply being seen. Months passed. The second book was accepted for publication. I started getting offers to teach workshops. I moved out of the rented room and into a small studio, bright and quiet, with a window that caught the morning sun. And then something happened I never expected. My father invited me to the next family reunion. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure I could go back to that backyard. That table. But then he sent another message. This time I'd like you to say a few words. If you're willing. I sat for a long time with that message open. Then I wrote back. I will. But I'm not the same Ethan. He replied, that's the Ethan I want to hear from. The day of the reunion arrived like a distant thunder. Slow, low, and impossible to ignore. I spent the morning pacing my small studio. Rehearsing what I might say. Not a speech exactly. Just thoughts. Truths. But the words kept slipping away, replaced by memories I hadn't asked to revisit. The driveway. My father's voice echoing. The laughter that turned to silence. The way my feet carried me away that day while my heart stayed behind, broken and waiting. But this time I wasn't going back to seek approval. I wasn't chasing their pride or hoping for applause. I was going as someone whole, flawed but whole. Someone they couldn't call a loser anymore. Not because of success, but because I had rewritten the script they once forced me into. I arrived late on purpose. Let them settle first. Let them feel the absence a little before the presence walked in. When I did, the backyard looked almost the same. Same folding tables. Same checkered tablecloths. The same plastic cups and overcooked burgers. But the air was different. Or maybe I was. People noticed me. Some smiled cautiously. Some avoided eye contact. Some looked surprised like seeing a ghost. But Mark stood up and gave me a brief hug. Glad you came, he said. You look good. Thanks, I said. You too. Lily approached next. I read your second book, she said softly. I cried through chapter 6. Chapter 6 was the hardest to write. I could tell, she said. I'm sorry I didn't say anything before. It's okay, I said. We were all quiet. Then came my father. He wasn't holding a beer this time. No fake cheer in his voice. Just a nod. Ready? He asked. I took a breath. Yeah. The makeshift microphone was set up by the grill. I stood before the family that once saw me as a punchline. And for the first time I wasn't afraid. I wasn't trying to impress or to win back lost years. I was simply telling the truth. I don't have a speech, I began. I have a story. My story. And if you've read my books you already know pieces of it. But I want to say something here face to face. Not to blame anyone. Not to stir old shame. Just to show you who I became. Silence. Stillness. Faces leaning in. A while ago at a reunion just like this I walked away. And I know some of you thought I was weak. Lost. Broken. Maybe I was. But in leaving I found something I couldn't find here. My voice. My self-worth. My truth. I paused, letting the words settle. I spent a long time thinking that being different made me a disappointment. That not fitting into your molds made me a failure. But I've learned that there's power in rebuilding. There's beauty in breaking away and returning not as the black sheep, but as someone who no longer needs your approval to stand tall. A few heads nodded. Some looked down. My mom wiped a tear. My story isn't special because it ends in success. It's meaningful because it started in silence and ended in truth. And the truth is, I'm proud of the man I became, even if it took walking away to become him. When I finished, there was no applause. Just stillness. Which somehow meant more. My dad stepped forward. For a moment I thought he might say something. Instead he simply placed a hand on my shoulder. Not heavy. Not performative. Just real. Later, as the evening settled and laughter returned to the yard, I sat under a tree with a paper plate of food I barely touched. Mark joined me. Do you hate us? He asked suddenly. No, I said. But I needed space to learn how to love myself without needing you to do it first. He nodded. That's fair. We sat in silence. I'm proud of you, you know, he added. Not because of the books. Because you didn't give up. Thanks, I said, and this time I believed it. That night as I drove home, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not closure, not exactly. But a peace born of no longer needing what they couldn't give. A peace born of becoming the kind of man who could walk back into the fire without burning. I arrived at my apartment, turned on the light, and saw a message blinking on my answering machine. It was from the college. They wanted to offer me a part-time lecturer position. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because life in all its strange poetry was finally listening. I walked to the window. The night was still. The stars scattered like ink spills across black paper. And I whispered more to myself than anyone. I made it back. Not to them. To me. The offer from the college felt surreal. Me, a lecturer? It wasn't a full-time position, nor was it prestigious by any means, but it symbolized something I had been chasing for years without knowing it. Legitimacy. Not just as a writer but as someone with something worth saying. I spent the weekend thinking it over. Part of me feared stepping into a classroom. What if they saw right through me? What if I failed? But another part, the part one had slowly built back from nothing, whispered, "You belong here now." I called the department head on Monday. Her voice was warm, grounded. She said the students had responded incredibly well to my talk and that they were eager for more. "You don't need to be a traditional academic," she said. "You just need to be honest." So I said yes. They gave me a course, Creative Writing Through the Lens of Survival. 15 students. A 3-month seminar. I crafted a syllabus not around literary theory but around courage. Every week focused on a different layer of truth-telling: shame, grief, memory, identity, and healing. My first day I walked into the classroom trembling. But the students were kind. They weren't looking for perfection. They were looking for permission. To be raw, to be unfiltered, to say the things they'd swallowed for years. I gave them that permission. And they gave it back to me. One girl, Ava, wrote about her father's drinking. Another, Jamal, wrote about growing up feeling invisible. There were poems, monologues, letters never sent. Every week the air in that room got heavier and more sacred. And with each session I remembered why I started writing in the first place. Not to impress but to survive. Outside the classroom life continued to unfold. The second book sold better than expected. It didn't hit any bestseller list, but it created ripples. A podcast invited me on. Then another. Invitations to speak at book fairs, libraries, even one small TEDx event. Each time I felt the same voice inside me say, "This is what happens when you stop running from your truth." Then something unexpected happened. I received a letter from my father. Handwritten. 2 pages. I stared at the envelope for nearly an hour before opening it. His handwriting was neat but slightly shaky. The letter began with a memory. Me at age 10 trying to fix a broken bike chain with my bare hands. "You didn't wait for help," he wrote. "You just kept trying until the thing moved again." He said he didn't know how to love someone like me when I was growing up. "You were sensitive, imaginative. You felt things I didn't understand, and I was scared that the world would eat you alive. So I tried to toughen you. And in doing that, I hurt you." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just said he wanted me to know that he saw it now. That he wished he'd seen it sooner. That the day I walked away from the reunion was the day he started questioning everything he thought made a man strong. "I don't know how many years I have left," he wrote, "but I hope some of them can be spent watching the man you've become. Not from a distance, but beside you." I folded the letter and set it on my nightstand. Forgiveness is a choice. And sometimes it's a choice we have to keep making. Weeks passed. I invited him to a reading event for my students. He came. Sat in the back, quiet but fully present. Afterward he shook hands with Ava. With Jamal. With others. Then he came up to me. "You gave them something I never gave you," he said. "A space to be heard." I looked him in the eyes. "You can give it now." And he nodded. That night I wrote a new story. It wasn't about Liam. It wasn't about me. It was about a man who built walls so high around his heart that he forgot why he built them in the first place. A man who mistook silence for strength and pride for love. And a son who learned that sometimes, it's not the apology that heals us. It's the moment we realize we no longer need it to move forward. The story poured out of me steady and certain. It was the cleanest I'd ever written. I sent it to my publisher. They called me the next morning. "This," they said, "is the one. We planned a release for the following spring." My agent suggested a book tour. I agreed, but with one condition. Every city, every stop had to include time with youth groups, shelters, libraries, places where invisible people could be heard. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about echoing the voices that had once saved me in my darkest moments. It was about making sure that no one like Ethan, or Ava, or Jamal ever had to believe they were a disappointment just because they didn't fit the mold. My family came to the book launch. Not just my parents. Mark, Lily, their kids. My mother cried through my reading. My dad stood beside me for the signing table. When someone asked him what he thought of the story, he said, "It taught me how to listen." After the crowd thinned out, he leaned in and said, "This time I'm proud of all my children. Especially the one I misunderstood the longest." I didn't need to hear it. But God, it still mattered. And in that moment I realized, healing doesn't always come in thunderclaps. Sometimes it comes in quiet sentences. Sometimes it's just two people standing side by side, finally speaking the same language. And sometimes it's a man looking in the mirror and saying, "I'm not the shame of this family. I'm its redemption." After the book tour, something unexpected happened. I came home to dozens of letters. Not emails. Letters. Handwritten, folded with care, sealed with vulnerability. People from all over the country who had read my story and felt seen, really seen, for the first time. There were letters from men in prison, from teenagers hiding journals under their beds, from women who had raised children alone and never once been asked how they felt. One letter stood out. It was from a man named Jerome, who had lost his son to suicide 2 years earlier. His writing was shaky, filled with ink smudges and heartbreak. "Your story made me realize I never told my son I was proud of him," he wrote. He was sensitive, creative. He cried at movies and couldn't throw a football to save his life. I thought I was helping him by toughening him. Now I see. I only made him believe that who he was wasn't enough. I read that letter 3 times. Then I folded it and placed it next to my father's letter in a small wooden box I now kept on my desk. My reminders. My anchors. My proof that stories save lives. I started getting more speaking requests. Not just from schools and book clubs, but from correctional facilities, mental health centers, rehab programs. Places where silence had calcified into shame. One cold January morning, I found myself inside a juvenile detention center, standing in front of 15 teenage boys with hard eyes and tired souls. They didn't smile. They didn't lean in. But they listened. I didn't talk about success. I didn't wave around my books or show off quotes from reviews. I talked about being invisible. About the day my own father humiliated me in front of my family. About walking away from everything I knew just to survive. And slowly the walls in that room began to crack. One boy, Derek, spoke up first. My mom told me I was a mistake, he said. I started stealing just so she'd notice when I got caught. I didn't try to fix him. I just said, that pain? You can turn it into something. It doesn't have to rot inside you. At the end of the session, each of them received a copy of my book. Most held it like a foreign object. But Derek hugged his like it weighed something sacred. As I walked to my car that day, I cried. I seem to cry more often these days, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming truth that the life I had once tried to abandon had become something I never imagined. A lifeline for others. Back home, the writing didn't stop. I started working on my third book, this one less linear, more raw. A tapestry of voices. Stories based on the letters I had received, with permission. I wanted the world to hear these people. To feel them. To know they existed beyond statistics and stereotypes. My father offered to help. He had started volunteering at a local community center. Sometimes he sat with young men, just listened. He said it felt like redemption. I can't fix what I did, he told me once. But maybe I can stop someone else from making the same mistake. He came to every reading I did after that. Sometimes with my mom. Sometimes alone. He always sat in the front row. One night, after a reading at a university, a man in the audience stood up. I'm a father, he said. And I want to ask you something. How do I love a son I don't understand? The room went quiet. Every eye turned to me. Thought of my father. Of our silence. Of the pain I'd carried for years. You don't have to understand him, I said. You just have to choose him. Every day. Even when he's confusing. Even when he disappoints you. Because the moment you make your love conditional, you stop being a home. And start being a war zone. The man sat down, hands trembling. The audience erupted in quiet applause. Afterward, my father hugged me. That line, he whispered. I'll carry that with me to my grave. And I believed him. As spring melted into summer, I found myself returning to the park where I used to sit in silence, notebook in hand, writing with no destination. I sat on the same bench. Looked at the same tree that had once offered me shelter when the world felt unbearable. A little boy was running circles around his mother. She looked exhausted but also peaceful. He tripped and scraped his knee. Cried. She knelt beside him and said, It's okay to cry. You're not weak. You're just hurt. I smiled. That boy would grow up knowing something I hadn't. That sensitivity isn't a flaw. It's a superpower. That day I wrote the dedication for my next book. To the children who were never allowed to cry, to dream, to be fragile, may you find your voice and may it roar. I sent the manuscript off with tears in my eyes. Not tears of grief. Tears of becoming. Because I was no longer just surviving. I was creating something bigger than myself. A legacy not of shame but of truth. And that, I realized, is what it means to win. Summer came with the kind of quiet heat that makes you slow down, pay attention. I spent most mornings in my studio writing, editing, sometimes just staring out the window, listening to the city breathe. There was a calm in my life I hadn't felt before. Not the absence of chaos, but the presence of purpose. One particular morning, I received a call from a woman named Naomi. She was the director of a center for LGBTQ+ youth who had been rejected by their families. She had read my second book and said, Your words felt like home for some of our kids. She invited me to come speak. I said yes before she could finish the sentence. The center was a small 2-story house painted blue, nestled between apartment complexes. Inside, the walls were covered with murals painted by the kids. Colorful, defiant, vulnerable. One read, We exist. We matter. We survive. Naomi introduced me to a small group of teens no older than 16. Some looked scared. Some angry. All of them carried that same shadow in their eyes. The one I used to see every time I looked in the mirror. I didn't bring notes. I didn't need them. I told them about being told I wasn't enough. About carrying silence like a second skin. about how writing became the one place I could be myself without apology. They listened. Not with awe, but with recognition. After I spoke, a kid named Riley raised their hand. What if my story doesn't have a happy ending? I smiled. Then make sure it has a true one. Riley nodded. I think I'm ready to write mine. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those kids. About how many of them were just one cruel comment away from giving up. About how powerful it was to be seen. So I started something new. A digital platform called Echoes. A space for stories the world tried to silence. Submissions came in from everywhere. Anonymous poems, raw confessions, journal entries that had never seen the light. We published one every day. No editing. No filtering. Just truth. The site grew faster than I expected. Thousands of readers. Dozens of volunteers. Even a few grants. Schools started using it in classrooms. Counselors said it was helping them connect with students in ways they never had before. Echoes wasn't just a platform. It was a movement. And for the first time I understood what legacy meant. It wasn't about awards or fame. It was about building something that lived on long after you were gone. Back in my personal life, things continued to shift. My father and I started having regular Sunday calls. Sometimes we talked about books. Sometimes about nothing at all. Once he told me he had started writing a journal. I'm not a writer, he said. But it helps me make sense of who I used to be. That's all writing ever is, I told him. One Sunday he asked if I'd read one of his entries. I was nervous. Not because I expected it to be bad, but because I feared what it might reveal. He emailed me a scanned page. Read. I was wrong. Not just once but many times. I mistook fear for wisdom. Silence for strength. I taught my son that love had to be earned. And now I'm unlearning everything I thought made me a man. Ethan taught me that. Without shaming me. Without punishing me. Just by being who he is. I didn't reply immediately. I just sat there staring at the screen, hands trembling. Later I wrote back, "Thank you. For trying. That's all I ever wanted." Fall approached and with it came another unexpected invitation. This time from a national talk show. They wanted to feature Echoes and interview me live. I hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted that kind of attention. But my editor said something that stuck with me. Don't hide now. You didn't come this far to whisper. So I went. The studio was cold and loud. The lights blinding. But when the host asked me, "What do you say to people who once called you a failure?" I didn't flinch. I looked into the camera and said, "I say thank you. Because every time they told me I wasn't enough, they unknowingly pushed me toward the truth of who I am. And now I don't need their approval. I have my own." The clip went viral. Overnight, thousands more found Echoes. We were flooded with messages. One stood out from a woman in her 70s who wrote, "I've been carrying a secret for 50 years. I never thought anyone would want to hear it. But now, maybe I can finally let it breathe." That night I walked through the city in silence, letting the wind wrap around me like a memory. I had spent so many years trying to prove my worth. But now worth wasn't something I had to earn. It was something I carried. Every scar, every silence, every sentence. They weren't just remnants of pain. They were proof of survival. And the boy they once called the shame of the family? He had become the voice that helped others heal. Not by shouting, but by whispering the truth loud enough to echo. Winter came early that year. The kind that blanketed the city in quiet, made people walk slower, breathe deeper. The kind that felt like a pause before something new. I had just returned from a panel event in Chicago, where I'd spoken about storytelling as a tool for survival. Afterward, a young woman approached me with a trembling voice and said, "You don't know it, but your words pulled me back from the edge." It wasn't the first time someone had said that. And yet it never stopped shaking me. Because once I had stood at that same edge, wondering if my voice mattered, if my existence did. And now I was helping others step back from it. Echoes was now a living, breathing thing, curated by a team of 7 with thousands of submissions a month. Schools, shelters, youth centers. It had woven itself into the fabric of communities. We had published over 1,200 stories. But one submission changed everything. It came from a girl named Isabel, 15 years old. The subject line read, "I'm writing this because it's my last night." I froze. Her story was raw, brutal, stripped of anything resembling hope. She'd been bullied relentlessly. told by her own family that she was too much, too emotional, too sensitive. They call me a drama queen, she wrote. But I'm just drowning in a world that never learned how to swim beside me. I called Naomi at the LGBTQ+ youth center. Sent the letter. Within hours they tracked Isabel down. She was still alive. They brought her in, got her care, wrapped her in the kind of safety net I wish I'd had at that age. 3 weeks later she sent me a new story. This one ended with the line, "Maybe I'm not meant to disappear. Maybe I'm meant to become the voice that saves someone else someday." I printed that story and hung it in the hallway of our new office, right next to my first rejection letter, framed in gold. Pain doesn't always disappear, but when you give it a voice, it can become a lifeline. Meanwhile, my relationship with my father had found a strange rhythm. We didn't talk every day, but we talked. And that was more than I ever imagined. He came to me one afternoon with a question that stunned me. "Would you help me write my story?" At first, I thought he meant a biography. But no, he wanted to write about his own childhood. About the pain he never told anyone. About the father who raised him with fists instead of words. "I think part of the reason I failed you," he said quietly, "is because no one ever showed me how to do better." We started meeting every Saturday. Coffee. Old photos. Long silences. We pieced together fragments of his life. I wrote down what he told me. Sometimes he would stop mid-sentence, eyes glazed with something between memory and regret. "I didn't know I was allowed to talk about this," he'd say. "That's why we have to," I'd reply. Took months. But eventually he had a draft. We printed it. Bound it. Not for publication. Just for us. He titled it, "The Silence Ends Here." The day I gave him the final copy, he held it like it was sacred. "I thought I'd die carrying this," he whispered. "You didn't," I said. "You rewrote the ending." And that's when I knew something deep. Something I hadn't put into words until that moment. Redemption isn't just healing your wounds. It's becoming the person who helps others heal theirs. Spring came. I was invited to give the commencement speech at a university I once walked past with my head down, convinced I wasn't good enough. I stood before hundreds of students, families, deans. I wore a black suit with a pen in my pocket. My first pen, the one I'd bought with tips from dishwashing. When I took the stage, I didn't start with inspiration. I started with honesty. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was supposed to disappear quietly, remembered only as the kid who couldn't make his father proud. But I'm here because I chose to speak. And because I refused to believe that silence was my destiny. I told them about echoes. About Isabel. About my father's book. About pain, yes, but also about transformation. "Your story," I said, "might not be a bestseller. It might not win awards. But if it's honest, if it's yours, it will find someone who needs it. And in doing that, you will live forever in the hearts of people you'll never meet." Standing ovation. Later that night, I got a call from a publisher. They wanted to turn Echoes into a printed anthology, a volume of the most powerful stories from the project. I agreed. But only if every writer could remain anonymous, unless they chose otherwise. "This isn't about spotlight," I said. "It's about survival." The publisher agreed. The anthology came out 6 months later. It hit bestseller list. It was translated into 5 languages. But what mattered most was this. In the back of the book we included a page that read, "To the reader holding this, you are not broken. You are becoming." I began receiving letters from countries I'd never visited. People who couldn't speak English but had underlined phrases in translation. One letter from a woman in Poland simply said, "You saved my daughter's life." And so, the boy they called the disappointment became a force that sparked healing across oceans. And yet I remained grounded. Still writing. Still listening. Still returning to that bench in the park. Still carrying every story like a candle. Still whispering, "You matter. You belong. Your voice is enough." The first time I held the printed Echoes anthology in my hands, I cried. Not because it had my name on the cover, though it did in small print as the editor, but because inside those pages were voices that had once been buried. I ran my fingers over the paper slowly, reverently, like I was touching something alive. The launch was modest. A small independent bookstore in New York hosted a reading. We invited a few contributors who had agreed to share their pieces publicly. One by one they stood at the mic, hands trembling, eyes scanning unfamiliar faces. And one by one they turned their pain into poetry. A man named Samuel read a letter to his teenage self. "You don't have to keep pretending. They lied when they said real men don't cry." A woman named Farah shared a poem about leaving an abusive marriage after 10 years of silence. I spoke finally, and my voice cracked the ceiling above me. A trans teenager named Julian read an essay titled "I Was Never a Mistake." By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. After the event, a woman in her 60s came up to me and pressed a note into my hand. "I'm not ready to speak yet," she whispered. "But I wanted to be here. To listen. To begin." That night, I walked the streets of New York alone, the city alive around me, and felt a strange kind of stillness settle inside. Not emptiness. Not sorrow. Just a kind of peace that comes from knowing you're doing exactly what you were put on this earth to do. Back in my studio, I started writing again. Not another novel, but something new. A memoir. For years, I had avoided telling my story head-on. I'd danced around it, renamed the characters, blurred the lines. But now it was time to write it as it happened. Not for pity. Not for revenge. But because truth deserves light. I called it The Boy Who Wasn't Chosen. I started with the reunion. The moment my father stood up, eyes burning, and declared his pride for everyone but me. And from there, I unraveled the years of silence, the ache of invisibility, the nights I wrote in secret, desperate to become someone who mattered. It was the hardest thing I'd ever written. Not because I didn't remember, but because I remembered everything. The exact pitch of my father's laugh as he mocked my dreams. The cold stare of relatives who pretended not to hear. The way I had looked at my hands for years, wondering if maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was, in fact, unlovable. But I didn't stop. And page by page, something unexpected happened. As I told the truth, not just about the pain, but about the moments of quiet grace, the people who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself, I began to forgive. Not to excuse. Not to forget. But to release. I finished the first draft in 3 months. My publisher cried when she read it. "We've been waiting for this," she said. "The world needs it." As the book went into production, I took a step back from travel. Spent more time with my writing group. With my family. With myself. My father continued journaling. He started reading at local libraries to kids. Sometimes they asked him about his son. "He's a writer," he'd say proudly. "And he taught me how to be a better man." My mother, once quiet in the background, began volunteering at a shelter for homeless youth. "I wish I had known better back then," she told me once. "But I know better now." And Mark, my brother who had once echoed our father's harsh words, called me out of the blue one night. "I read your memoir," he said. "Twice. I waited. I didn't know," he finally said. "I should have. But I didn't. And I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you." "Thank you," I said. "Can I take you to dinner sometime?" We met a week later. Sat in silence for most of the meal. But at the end he said, "You changed everything. Not just your life. Ours too." I didn't need validation anymore. But that moment, it healed something I didn't know was still open. When The Boy Who Wasn't Chosen hit shelves, the response was unlike anything I'd experienced. Letters poured in by the thousands. People thanking me. People asking how to begin their own healing. People finally saying, "Me too." I went on tour again. But this time I wasn't afraid. Because this time I wasn't just telling my story. I was holding up a mirror. At a stop in Seattle, a man stood in the signing line holding a battered copy of my first book. He said, "I used to read this to my son. He died 2 years ago. But your words were the only thing that made him smile at the end. I just wanted you to know that." I signed his book and held his hand a little longer than necessary. Because what else can you do when your words become someone's final comfort? I returned home tired but full. And one evening, as snow fell silently outside my window, I sat with my father by the fire. We didn't talk. Just sat. And then he whispered, "I think I chose the wrong version of strength all those years ago." I looked at him. "And now?" I asked. "Now I know the strongest thing a man can do is say, 'I was wrong. And I still want to learn.'" I reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're learning," I said. "And I'm proud of you." He smiled. "It took me long enough." I smiled back. "Some stories take time." It was almost ironic that the most painful parts of my life, the ones I once wanted to erase, had become the foundation of everything I was building. Every time I stood on a stage, every time I opened a message from a stranger, every time someone looked at me with tears in their eyes and whispered, "Your words helped me breathe again," I felt both the weight and the honor of being trusted with so much. But with that trust came something else too: responsibility. The more people shared their pain with me, the more I realized how many were still silenced. Not because they lacked stories, but because they lacked space, safe space, brave space. And so, I started dreaming bigger. What if Echoes wasn't just a platform? What if it was a physical place? A real building? A center? A sanctuary? A place where anyone, young or old, broken or whole, could come and write, or speak, or cry, or simply sit in silence and not be asked to explain it. I brought the idea to a few trusted people. Naomi, my editor, my father. All of them said the same thing: it's time. So I started searching for spaces. I found one on the outskirts of the city, an old library that had been abandoned for years. The floors were cracked, the windows broken, but the bones were strong. It had history. It had potential. We launched a fundraiser. I spoke about the vision online, in interviews, at conferences. Within 2 months, we had raised enough to purchase the building outright. Donations came from everywhere. Some were large. Most were small. But each one came with a note. For my sister. For the child I used to be. For the friend who didn't survive. The day we signed the papers, I stood in the middle of the empty building and whispered, "We made it." Renovations took almost a year. We kept the original brick walls. Refinished the hardwood floors. Added a cafe, quiet writing rooms, a recording booth for spoken word. We built a library filled only with books written by survivors. And in the heart of the space, we built a round room with 4 pillows and no agenda. A place just to exist. We named it the Sanctuary of Echoes. The grand opening was emotional. People traveled from all over to be there. Isabel came. So did Julian. Even Samuel, now 70, flew in with his son. We held a reading in the main hall. This time I didn't read. I just listened. Because that's what this place was about. Not about me. Not anymore. After the event, I found a quiet corner in the sanctuary and watched people move through the space. I saw a teenage boy writing furiously in a notebook. A woman reading aloud to herself in one of the pods. An elderly man staring at the wall of framed stories, tears streaming down his face. And I felt it again, that sacred stillness. That sense that I was exactly where I was meant to be. A few weeks later, I received an invitation I never expected. The National Education Board wanted to adopt Echoes as part of their mental health and creative writing curriculum. At first, I was hesitant. Bureaucracy scared me. But then I thought about Isabel. About how one voice, hers, deserved to reach as many hearts as possible. So I agreed. We spent months adapting the stories into curriculum guides, workshops, group exercises. We made sure every lesson honored the rawness, the integrity, the messiness of healing. Soon, Echoes was in schools across the country. And it didn't stop there. Letters started coming in from Brazil, South Africa, Japan. Translators offered to volunteer. We built regional hubs, virtual sanctuaries, a global community of voices refusing to disappear. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I realized something. I was no longer the boy who wasn't chosen. I was the man who built a home for the unheard. On the anniversary of the original family reunion, yes, that one, I received a message from Lily. She wanted to host another. This time not in competition. Not with lists of who accomplished what. Just a gathering, she wrote. A celebration. Of healing. I said yes. We met in a park near her home. There were blankets, food, and for the first time in years, laughter. Real laughter. Even my dad cracked jokes. My mom told stories from her childhood. Mark brought his daughter, who ran up to me and said, "I read your book in school." I froze. "You did?" "Yeah," she beamed. My teacher cried while reading us a chapter. We all wrote our own stories after. I knelt down. "And what did you write about?" He thought for a second. "About how sometimes people think I talk too much. But I don't care. I have good things to say." I hugged her tightly. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark handed me a photo. It was from the reunion years ago, the one where everything broke. He had kept it all this time. "I think you should have it," he said. In the photo I was standing alone, arms crossed, face half-turned. Behind me my father laughing. Mark mid-conversation. Everyone else distant. I stared at it for a long time. Then I turned it over and wrote. This was the day I stopped waiting to be chosen. And started choosing myself. I didn't keep it hidden. I hung it in my office at the Sanctuary of Echoes. Right next to a plaque that read, "Every voice matters. Especially yours." It was strange sometimes how the past didn't vanish. It just softened. Like scars that fade but never quite disappear. Reminders not of what hurt, but of what healed. In the months after the reunion, life settled into something I hadn't had in a long time. Rhythm. Every morning I opened the sanctuary by unlocking the tall front doors, always just a few minutes before sunrise. There was something sacred about being the first one inside, letting the silence stretch across the wood floors, feeling the echo of stories still hanging in the air. Writers came in all shapes and silences. There was the retired firefighter who brought a thermos of tea and typed with 2 fingers. The pregnant woman who wrote about her unborn daughter and what she hoped to teach her. The boy who barely spoke but always sat in the sunlit corner with his journal, never missing a day. And every week without fail Riley came. Riley had grown. Taller, more grounded. Their story had been the first published on Echoes after we launched the digital platform, and now, years later, they were a volunteer coordinator for the sanctuary. They ran the youth writing group on Saturdays, where laughter and tears danced in equal measure. One Saturday I walked past the group just as Riley was saying, "You're allowed to write something that doesn't have an ending yet. Some stories are still unfolding." I stopped in my tracks. My chest tightened. Because that's exactly what I had been feeling lately, that even with all I'd done, all I'd built, my own story wasn't finished. There was something still calling. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in my apartment looking out at the city lights, thinking about a letter I had received weeks earlier. It was from a small school in a remote part of Montana. The teacher wrote, "We don't have a writing program. We barely have books. But the kids here, many of them hurting, deserve stories too. Could you come?" I had meant to say yes. But things were busy. The sanctuary needed me. Or so I told myself. Now I picked up the letter again. Maybe it wasn't just about building a sanctuary for voices to come to me. Maybe I needed to go to them. The next morning I met with Naomi and the team. I told them I needed to step away. Not forever. Just long enough to do something brave again. "I want to take Echoes on the road," I said. "To the places that feel forgotten. Places where kids think no one is listening." To my surprise, they didn't resist. They nodded. "We've got this," Naomi said. "Go." I mapped out the route. Small towns, shelters, reservation schools, juvenile centers. I called it the Road of Echoes. We converted an old van into a mobile writing space. Shelves of blank notebooks, a small library, a fold-down stage for readings. Before I left, my father handed me a package. "Open it later," he said. The first stop was a trailer park school in Nebraska. 20 students, most never having written more than a paragraph. But by the end of the workshop, one girl stood up and read a piece about her brother in prison and how she still wrote letters he never answered. "I thought I hated him," she read. "But I don't. I just missed the version of him before the world got so heavy." I cried with them. We went town by town. Sometimes we slept in the van. Sometimes strangers opened their homes. And everywhere we went, people wrote. Stories of grief. Of resilience. Of absurd hope. In Mississippi, a boy wrote about being called a mistake. In Colorado, a girl read her poem under the stars. "I am not what they see. I am the breath behind the bruise." In every place I left behind notebooks. I told them, "You don't need me to keep going. You just need a pen and your truth." A month into the journey, I finally opened my father's package. Inside was a leather-bound notebook. On the first page he had written, "For every step you take that I couldn't. For every voice you lift that I once silenced. I am proud of you. Not because of what you've done, but because of who you became in spite of me." I pressed the notebook to my chest and cried in the van until I couldn't breathe. In Montana I reached that small school. The one that had sent the letter. The students had made a banner, "Welcome Ethan," in crooked letters and glitter glue. The teacher introduced me like I was a rock star. I sat on the edge of a desk and asked them what they thought stories were made of. "Pain," said one. "Dreams," said another. Everything nobody ever listens to, said a boy in the back. We wrote all day. At the end I asked if anyone wanted to read. No one moved. Then a girl raised her hand. She stood, shaking, and read a piece about watching her mom overdose. About trying to shake her awake while the neighbors whispered. I thought if I said it out loud I'd break, she said. But I didn't. He didn't. And neither did I. That night, as the stars blinked above the Montana fields, I sat outside and wrote in my father's notebook. Maybe strength isn't how loud you speak. Maybe it's how deeply you listen. Maybe it's not about being chosen or praised, but about choosing to stay, to show up, to keep writing even when the world goes quiet. When I returned to the sanctuary months later, it hadn't fallen apart without me. It had grown. New programs. More voices. More stories pinned to the walls. Riley met me at the door with a hug. We saved you a seat, they said. I sat in the round room that night, surrounded by candles, and watched as newcomers read their first lines into the room. And I thought, this is it. This is home. Not the one I was born into. The one I built. Brick by brick. Story by story. Echo by echo. The seasons turned again. Spring stretched into summer, and with it came a warmth I hadn't felt since I was a child. Not just in the air but in my body. My bones. My breath. It was the warmth of belonging, not to a person or even to a place but to a purpose. I stood at the second-floor balcony of the sanctuary one morning, coffee in hand, watching as people filed in. Some with notebooks. Some with fear. Some just with questions. And I thought about how far things had come from that first moment. The one where I walked out of a family reunion feeling like the invisible thread in a picture-perfect tapestry. Now I was the one weaving the thread. The summer brought new faces. A mother and daughter who had fled an abusive home and now came every week to write side by side. A young refugee boy who didn't speak much English, but told his story in watercolor and short phrases that left us breathless. An elderly man who had just come out as gay at the age of 78 and said, "It took me this long to stop hiding. But I'm here now." We launched a summer series, Stories Under the Sky. Every Friday we held evening readings on the rooftop. Lights strung above. Soft music. People reading with their voices shaking and strong all at once. And in those nights something happened. People who had never spoken before began to stand. And once they spoke they rarely stopped. One night, after a particularly powerful reading, a woman approached me. She looked familiar. "I'm sure you don't remember me," she said, "but I was at the reunion. The one where..." She didn't need to finish. "I remember," I said. She nodded slowly. I didn't say anything that day. I saw what happened and I stayed silent. "I'm sorry." I didn't know what to say. But then she added, "I started following echoes last year. It's changed me. I've started speaking up, for others. For myself. I think that's partly because of you." I looked at her not with anger but with a strange, soft kind of awe. "Thank you for telling me," I said. And I meant it. Because sometimes healing doesn't come in an apology. It comes in someone learning how to be better. That night I walked home under the stars and thought about all the versions of myself that never made it this far. The boy who almost gave up. The teen who swallowed his truth. The young man who thought being invisible was the only way to survive. I carried them all with me now. Not as ghosts, but as ancestors of the man I had become. At the end of the summer we hosted the largest gathering yet. Hundreds came to the sanctuary. Some from out of state. Some from outside the country. And we had only one rule. No performance. Only truth. There was a silence in the main hall that day unlike anything I had ever felt. Not heavy. Not afraid. Just sacred. A young man stood first. He was trembling. He looked no older than 20. He said, "I've never said this out loud. Not even to myself. But I need to say it here. My father hurt me. And for a long time I thought that meant I didn't deserve good things." No one interrupted. He continued, "But I'm tired of carrying his shame. So I'm leaving it here." He sat. And we applauded, not to praise but to hold. Another woman came forward. Middle-aged. She said, "I grew up in a home where we weren't allowed to cry. Not even at funerals. Today I'm going to read a poem I wrote for my brother. He died 5 years ago. I never got to say goodbye." Her voice broke halfway through. But she finished. And the room didn't break. It held her. One by one, stories came forward. Each one raw. Each one real. By the end of the event, I felt like I had witnessed something close to divine. Not in a religious sense, but in the way truth can sanctify a space. Later, Naomi found me in the hallway. "We need more buildings," she said. I laughed, tired and amazed. "You serious?" "Dead serious," she said. "We've started getting calls. Schools want partnerships. Cities want branches. We can't keep up." I sat with that for a while. And then I realized, we were no longer a story. We were a movement. That week, we began planning Sanctuary West, a second center in California. Then Sanctuary North in Chicago. Volunteers stepped up. Donors offered help. And we made a commitment. Wherever voices were being lost, we would build spaces to find them again. I traveled between cities that fall, helping set things up, training new staff, and always listening. Always gathering new stories. Some days I felt exhausted, but never empty. Because everywhere I went, someone reminded me why we did this. In Chicago, a teenager said, "You gave me my voice back." In California, a woman whispered, "You made me brave." And in New York, back at the original sanctuary, a quiet boy handed me a letter and said, "This is the first time I've written something that feels like me." I opened it when I got home. "Dear Ethan, my family says I'm too sensitive, that I should grow thicker skin. But your book made me think maybe my skin isn't the problem. Maybe the world just forgot how to handle people who feel deeply. I want to be a writer like you. Not famous. Just honest." I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer where I kept reminders. Not of accolades, but of why I started. That night I wrote again. Not for the world. Not for publication. Just for myself. A letter. To the boy I once was. You didn't get chosen that day. But look at what you chose instead. Look at what you built. Look at who you became. You didn't just survive. You became a sanctuary. A voice. A home. And I signed it. Love me. The rhythm of life had settled into something steady, but my mind was restless, always pushing forward. I kept thinking about the young voices I'd met on the road of echoes, the faces, the stories, the desperate hope behind them all. How many more were out there? How many more hadn't been heard yet? One evening, I was sitting in the sanctuary's round room, a soft amber glow from the candles casting gentle shadows on the walls. The room was quiet except for the scratch of pen on paper. Riley was leading a small group, the voices low and tentative. I watched as one teen, barely able to meet anyone's eyes, read a poem about feeling invisible. It hit me then, this wasn't just a building or a project. This was a lifeline. A beacon. A place where broken pieces could be gathered and somehow made whole again. I decided I needed to take echoes beyond the country's borders. The letters from distant places had been piling up for years. From Brazil to South Africa, Japan to India, the world was hungry for a space to share pain and healing. But this was a different challenge. A different scale. I reached out to some contacts. Nonprofit organizations, mental health advocates, translators who had volunteered to help bring echoes to new languages. Together we started sketching out the Global Echoes Initiative, a network of satellite sanctuaries linked virtually, creating a worldwide community united by storytelling. The first international hub would open in São Paulo, Brazil. I was both terrified and exhilarated. I barely spoke Portuguese, but I trusted the people I'd partnered with. They had passion, vision, the same hunger to create safe spaces for voices that so often went unheard. When I arrived in São Paulo, the city overwhelmed me. The vibrant colors, the cacophony of sounds, the mix of hope and hardship in the air. I met with local activists and youth leaders who told me stories not so different from those I'd heard at home. Stories of family struggles, of systemic barriers, of resilience fueled by sheer will. We held a community event to launch the sanctuary. Hundreds came. People who had never written before or never dared to share their truths, stepped up to the mic. A young woman spoke about surviving violence. A teenage boy shared a story about losing his mother to addiction. Each word was a thread weaving a new tapestry of healing and connection. I realized then how universal pain and hope truly were. Back in New York, the original sanctuary continued to flourish. Volunteers took over daily operations so I could focus on the global initiative. Yet I still returned often, walking the halls lined with stories, feeling the pulse of so many lives intertwined. One morning I received an email that would change everything. It was from a small village school in India. A teacher named Asha wrote, "We have no library, no safe spaces. But our children have stories. Stories that carry their pain and their dreams. Can echoes help us create a sanctuary here?" Without hesitation I said yes. Within months, a small team flew to India. They worked with local educators and counselors to build a space in the school. A quiet room filled with notebooks, art supplies, and walls painted with murals of hope. Letters started flowing back to us. From children who had never spoken about their fears or losses. From teachers who said they had never seen such transformation in their classrooms. One letter stood out. "I used to think I was alone. Now I know my story is part of something bigger. I am not broken. I am becoming." That phrase became a mantra for the global community. But expanding so quickly had its challenges. Different cultures had different taboos around mental health and expression. We had to listen carefully, adapt thoughtfully, never imposing but always inviting. There were moments of frustration. Funding shortages, logistical setbacks, moments when hope felt fragile. Yet in every setback I saw resilience. I thought about my father who once struggled to express himself, who found his voice late in life, who had taught me in his own imperfect way that healing was a journey, not a destination. I sat down to write him a letter. "Dad, every story we hold is a sacred thread. Thank you for teaching me to weave." One evening, as I prepared for a virtual conference with all the international hubs, I looked at a photo on my desk. It was from the reunion years ago, the moment that had sparked all of this. I no longer felt pain when I saw it. Instead, I saw the beginning of a story, my story, and the countless others that had found life because I refused to disappear. I closed my eyes and whispered, "This is just the beginning." And somewhere I felt a chorus of voices answer back. After the global launch, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of calls, emails, and meetings. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on my shoulders, but beneath it all was a quiet fire, a determination to keep the momentum alive. The stories from across continents echoed in my mind, reminding me why this work mattered so deeply. One afternoon, I received a message from a young woman named Amina, living in a refugee camp on the outskirts of Jordan. Her words were raw and urgent. "We have no safe spaces here. No voices. But I want to tell my story, if only someone will listen." I knew then that the initiative wasn't just about buildings or programs. It was about presence, about connection, about reaching into the silence and saying, "You are seen. You matter." With the help of local volunteers and translators, we established a virtual sanctuary for refugees, providing digital notebooks, storytelling workshops, and mental health support. Despite limited internet access and harsh conditions, stories began to flow. Stories of loss, survival, and fragile hope. One of Amina's stories stood out, a letter to her younger self, written with trembling honesty about fleeing war, losing family, and dreaming of a future beyond fear. It was shared widely, touching hearts globally. Meanwhile, back home, the original sanctuary blossomed into a hub for creative healing. Artists, poets, musicians, and writers gathered, their diverse expressions weaving new patterns of resilience. Riley's youth group expanded, now mentoring young storytellers who carried their own histories of pain and triumph. Ethan's journey as the founder of Echoes evolved in profound and transformative ways. His relationship with his once distant father deepened as they both immersed themselves in the mission of giving a voice to those who had been silenced. His father even began participating in events, reading his memoirs and embodying his own redemption. Over time, Echoes expanded beyond the borders of the United States, reaching places like South Africa, Nepal, Mexico, Greece, and Ireland. In each new location, powerful stories emerged. Survivors of apartheid, youth marked by violence, guardians of indigenous traditions, victims of family trauma. Ethan realized Echoes was more than a storytelling project. It was a living bridge between past and future, pain and healing, silence and expression. Despite global growth, challenges arose. Cultural differences, emotional fatigue, internal doubts. But every encounter reinforced the purpose. In moments of exhaustion, Ethan turned to writing letters. To himself, to his father, to the voices that had shaped him, as a way to stay grounded and focused. The community grew as well. Volunteers from all backgrounds joined, virtual events brought together transformative stories, and letters of gratitude arrived from distant places. Ethan knew Echoes was having a real, deep, and lasting impact. At the same time, his relationship with his father continued to evolve. As his father's health declined, they experienced moments of silent reconciliation. In one of those moments, his father gave Ethan an old notebook filled with personal reflections, a sign that the son had inspired him to find his own voice. One phrase written inside struck Ethan deeply: "Your voice gave me permission to find mine." The project kept growing, and Ethan recognized the importance of delegating and mentoring new leaders to ensure the mission's longevity. At an international conference, his speech moved a woman to tears. She confessed the stories of Echoes had saved her life. That moment reaffirmed the path he had chosen. The 10-year celebration of the sanctuary was a major milestone. What was once a humble space now radiated with art, words, and memories of healing. People of all ages shared powerful experiences. Riley, now one of the movement's leaders, spoke about the strength of community. The voices present formed a true symphony of resilience. At the end of the night, Ethan retreated to his office and wrote in his father's notebook words of gratitude and devotion, a tribute to every voice, every story, every soul that had found refuge in Echoes. He recognized that, though the journey would continue, this was a necessary pause to look back and honor every step taken. The boy who once felt invisible had finally found his voice. And that voice would never be silenced again.